Now I'll have some fun. Joining me now, Jason Miller, old friend, former senior advisor to the Trump transition team, and Mr. Mark Mitchell, head pollster at Rasmussen Reports. Gentlemen, thank you for doing this. We're going to talk about ICE later. I mean, that's just way too easy. But I do want to ask pollster Mark Mitchell from Rasmussen, how's the ICE thing polling, okay? And people have now seen whatever they've seen. I've seen some polls where Trump went down, but he's come back up. Can you just give us a quick snapshot of what your poll shows on the question of, ICE and these blue cities?
Donald Trump got elected last year because every one of his policies was more popular than he was, especially his policies of mass deportation, which was in the 60s, and that is held. And the idea of getting rid of criminal illegals is pretty close to 80. So these things are very popular, but what's happened is also his approval has dropped. It actually hit negative 16 net points today, 41% approve. That's worse than it's been all the way going back to December of 2017. So people are not liking what he's doing. And a lot of it is because of the ICE optics. We've seen over the last couple of months an uptick in people who support sanctuary policies, and a plurality of Americans now say that ICE tactics are too harsh. And so we have this situation where people don't like the optics that are coming out of it, and yet they also don't like the fact that we haven't deported more people. But I think there's this whole other tool set that we haven't really touched at all, and that is going after the businesses. And that's very, very, very popular in the poll.
Going after the business meaning what? I'm not sure I understood that last part.
Well, we have this E-Verify system that's really popular. 68% support it. Should the federal government impose strong penalties against U.S. employers who knowingly hire illegals? That's 55 to 29. That's plus 26 when Donald Trump is negative 16. So pretty much anything systematic that we can do to lower the number of illegals in this country, very popular. But the idea of jackbooted thugs shooting people in the face with tear gas canisters on nightly news, that's not as popular.
Well, Jason Miller, okay, jackbooted thugs and so forth. I get that. But, Jason, Republicans can't give in here. They can't give in to the Schumer demands because it just seems to me, first of all, I think Lindsey Graham's got a great point. Stop the sanctuary cities. The sanctuary cities, when you walk through it, they're the source of so much of the violence and the shootings because the local police can't release them in the same prison. That's one point. The second point is they can't just allow some sort of amnesty to redevelop. I don't think that's what voters really want. Jason Miller, do you?
Well, exactly. And I think you're getting to the point, Larry, in the fact that what this is really about from Democrats is they want to defund ICE and they want to stop it from local mayors or local governors from having to cooperate with federal law enforcement or federal border patrol or immigration officials. That's really what this is about. And I think for the Democrats to try to hold DHS funding hostage with only 9 days to go, whether it be with regard to FEMA or with the Coast Guard, these are important things that we need to keep the government going. So I think this is really a distraction. Larry, you showed earlier this list of 10 points that the Democrats supposedly want for compromise or reform. Really what it is a list of 20 excuses of why they don't want Democrat staff to cooperate with ICE and other agencies like that. And that's really what this is about. You take a look at whether it be Tampon Tim, the governor of Minnesota, or Jacob Frey, the mayor of Minneapolis. They refuse to cooperate with them. But when you look at the most dangerous cities in America, 5 of the top 10 most dangerous cities refuse to cooperate with ICE. Cities that do cooperate have a much safer level. That's the reason why President Trump has been able to help bring us to this 125-year low with regard to murders. And again, when we talk about ICE and local officials, 67% of people believe that ICE and other law enforcement agencies should work hand in hand with the local governments. But if they won't do it, then obviously ICE can't go back down.
I mean, Mark Mitchell, just we have other things to talk about from your polls. But on this point, let's just say what Tom Homan is doing strikes me as very good. He's a cool hand, Luke. Seems to be bringing the parties together. But sanctuary cities or somehow protecting illegals who have criminal records, the worst of the worst, I just can't believe that people don't want to see those criminals removed from the country. I have trouble with that.
Again, I think it's totally just about the optics. And this is drawing blood. Donald Trump's numbers are really hurting right now. He lost the 40% right direction polling he had pretty much all of last year. And a 41% approve is getting into Biden territory. But again, I think it can work as a sideshow in the circus. What the main ring needs to be, however, is systematic reform, because people like to say that Trump won because, oh, the border crisis, or he won. He won because people don't trust the federal government. Only 30% trust the federal government. Very ridiculously low number of people think today's children will be better off than their parents. And basically, they saw Biden weaponize the federal government against people. And so there is this really existential demand for systematic reform that I don't think we're seeing. I think corporations have a lot to do with it. Only 17% of Americans think that corporations don't have too much power in this country. By a 5-to-1 margin, people think that corporations have too much influence in the Trump administration. And so this was a guy that he got union votes for the first time. He talked a lot about the workers. He was in a McDonald's drive-through window. And here we are, again, the optics are not good, but he needs to fill them with something else. Everybody hates fraud. 76% of Americans are angry at the level of waste, fraud, and abuse. And that's how this Minneapolis thing started. It was about the fraud. We turned it into a thing about ICE.
Yeah, I want to come back to that. Just Jason Miller, craft a message. It's a mystery to me that as good as the economy seems to be, people don't believe it. It's a very odd story. And they're taking it out on Mr. Trump, even though the numbers are with him. Now, maybe he hasn't started to fight. He hasn't started the campaign yet. He's done a few things. But nonetheless, Jason, craft a message here. What's missing from the economic growth message when the numbers, the data themselves, are showing 4 to 5% economic growth, which is really quite remarkable?
Well, Larry, to go and steal a page from the old playbook, Americans better off with the economy now than they were under Joe Biden? And the answer is a resounding yes. Rate of inflation is dropping. Things are becoming less expensive. The purchasing power is people's paychecks are bigger, as no tax on tips or Social Security or overtime. Also, the business expensing, as all these things are kicking in now. Keep in mind, they just kicked in at the first of the year. Now people are starting to have more money that they can go and spend. And so, but Democrats don't want to talk about that. What they want to try to talk about are sideshows and distractions. Now, I think it's very important that the administration stay focused on this message of keeping the border secure and also deporting the criminal illegals. 73% of people think that those entering the country illegally have committed a crime. But Mark's exactly right when we talk about the optics being off here, because when people think about the border, they think about the border. When they think about law enforcement, they have a very specific vision of the law enforcement, but the optics right now aren't matching up. And I think the administration is making some very smart moves. They've said, yes, let's go and add body cams. This is a great idea. In fact, that's what exonerated some of these officials who were involved in these shootings. And so I think the administration is making some smart moves, but ultimately this is about the economy. The economy is on a rocket ship for Q1 and Q2, and if we're telling that story, then we're winning.
You know, Jason, I think it wouldn't hurt also if Republicans reminded voters that the Democrats, to a person in the Senate and the House, voted for a $5 trillion tax hike. To a person, okay, it was just, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was basically unanimous. Both Senate and House Democrats voted against the One Big Beautiful Bill, which would have meant a roughly $5 trillion tax hike. Also, there would have been no tax cuts on overtime or tips or seniors. I mean, it wouldn't matter. It's not a bad point to make. Wouldn't you agree, Jason?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Secretary Bessent was testifying in front of the Senate Finance Committee earlier today, and he had a great line when talking to Elizabeth Warren, and he kept referring to it as the Biden-Warren economy. And it made Senator Warren's head just absolutely explode in real time. But Secretary Bessent had a great point. Every one of those Democrats voted for record high inflation. Every one of those Democrats stood by Joe Biden as he allowed 15 million illegals to enter the country. That's over now. President Trump securing the border. He already has passed this One Big Beautiful Bill, the middle-class tax cuts. Now we have to go sell the message of how people's lives are much better now than they were under Joe Biden.
Mark Mitchell, I want to come back to one of your points, though, in an article. I think DOGE was rather popular. DOGE was popular. Cutting waste, fraud, and abuse was popular. And young people particularly liked it, but I think a lot of people liked it. And waste, fraud, and abuse, the GAO, estimated at roughly $550 billion. Of course, it was the Elon Musk. The DOGE thing seems to have gone away, or it's out of sight. And I think, I think that's a silver bullet that the GOP should have back.
It's one of the most popular things I think they ever had. It was like a gift to the Republican Party. We had a 60% under 40 job approval rating for Donald Trump. That should have brought Washington, D.C. to a screeching halt because they actually captured the zeitgeist of the youth. And again, these people don't agree that GDP is enough for them to have a healthy economy. They just don't. They've been priced out of the housing market. Their jobs have been given to people overseas. They're being flooded with H-1Bs. They are not in a good place. And these people also are not conservatives. They're really not. The under 40 conservatives are actually very socialistic. A lot of these people believe in nationalizing industries, like 3/4 of them. 56% of the under 40 conservatives want excess wealth confiscation. And what they really want is systematic reform. And so they love Doge. They were there for it. And then it just, disappeared, maybe to get the one big beautiful bill passed. I don't know. But this Minnesota thing was another opportunity to refocus on something. And it's like, okay, Democrats are winning right now in the generic ballot by 6 points. And a lot of that is because of perceived Republican dysfunction. Well, if you can't govern between now and November, the one thing you can do is give the youth the systematic reform they want. These people are most likely to want arrests for almost any scandal. They were most likely to agree with Donald Trump's quote that he who saves his country violates no laws. They really don't care about conservatism. They don't care about the rules. They want people who are fraudulent punished, and that includes businesses, that includes politicians. And I think they were expecting reform, draining the swamp, arrests, and a return to a golden age of America, which isn't GDP. It's not good enough.
Well, Jason Miller, all right, what happened to Doge? We had Doge, we had Elon. All right, and then Elon was gone. And now Elon is kind of back, but we're not talking Doge. Elon had his very smart lieutenants scattered through the government. They were very important and popular, but all of a sudden we don't hear anything from that. And I don't hear any more Doge cuts from waste, fraud, and abuse. Scott Besson talks about the GAO study, which really corroborated what Elon Musk and Doge was trying to do. $500–600 billion of waste, fraud, and abuse, and maybe more. But we don't hear any more of any of that. Jason, I think they're losing an important message here. I think Mark Mitchell's right.
Yeah, absolutely. And stopping fraud, stopping wasteful spending, wildly popular, even in both parties, except maybe with Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren. Now, this is another example, though, of the policy being very popular, but the implementation of it, the optics of it, didn't really connect with what they said they're going to do. So, for example, rather than talking about eliminating completely wasteful programs, then all the conversation came to who had access to what records, and it got really off track. I think there are a couple ways to get Doge and the concepts of getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, and waste, and especially the spending. I think number one, when you do an across-the-board reduction, give every department, give them a goal to go and do it, then it's really hard to go and counter saying, look, we should go and reduce the size of these budgets because we have to rein in spending. Number two, there's still entire agencies that we can go and chop, and a lot of them don't have formed constituencies that can put up a big fight. So let's do a combination. And the third thing, Larry, AI. This is a thing especially when you look at things like supply chains at the Department of War, you look at other ways of delivering services to Americans. We can do a lot more with a lot less if we're smart about how we use AI.
Mark Mitchell, give me 30 seconds. Can the Republicans still win the midterm elections? Just give me 30 seconds from your polling.
I mean, they need a Manhattan Project. They need message discipline. Donald Trump basically would have to be George Patton. He needs to be a wartime president, and it needs to be focused on brutal, visible government reform and draining the swamp and restoring the American middle class, economic populism, and a focus on increasing wages.
All right, there you go. 30 seconds worth. Thank you very much. Mark Mitchell of the Rasmussen poll and Jason Miller of Jason Miller, Inc., a very old friend of mine. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it very, very much. Hope you'll come back.